the series on the book of Genesis, I would like to tell a bit more now about the flood. Last time we took a look at the judgment time that Noah had to build the ark. The flood is the first big judgment. There's one more to come, but we won't speak about it now. The earth was corrupt. How corrupt we do not exactly know, but the Lord saw it was corrupt. And he had to act. And Noah had to build the ark for his family and for land animals and birds, two of its kind. And the Lord shut the door behind him when he went into the ark, and it was time for the flood to come, for the waters to cover the earth. So let's take a look. What exactly happened? The waters covering the earth. Let's read what the Bible tells us about it. A few verses out of chapter 7 of Genesis. Verses 11 and 12 first of all. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Let's read on in verse 17. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. The last verse of this chapter, verse 24, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So it was a big event. An event of not just a few days, but weeks on end and months on end. And it would take a year before Noah could get out of the ark again. Of course, scientists have tried to deduce from what they read in the Bible and what they know about all kind of physical processes, what kind of things happened there and then. And different models have been made. Of course, all these models are fallible. We just have to work out models and see whether they can fit the facts and whether they are plausible. And it's not easy. Different models have been proposed, and I have a preference for a few. But first of all, let's just read what happens. Take a look. The fountains of the great deep. That must have been the ocean. And if the ocean, the fountains of the great deep, were broken up, then the ocean floor must have been ripped up and lifted up, meaning tsunamis, of course, would have been caused by it, but also we have to ask ourselves the question, how come this happened? Some say there was a runaway subduction, that the ocean floor dived into the crust, dived into the magma, and new ocean floor was formed. Or others say, no, it could have been impacts of meteorites that could have caused it. Either way, volcanic activity must have played a big part, a big role. And a lot of heat being released, clouds of steam, of water will have evaporated into the air. And that is, of course, a good way to get torrential rains for days on end on the colder continent. Because if the ocean was hot because of the ocean crust being ripped up, broken up, then the continent still was colder. And then the torrential rains will have caused mudslides if it rains for a few days only here. Torrential rains, we know how much can happen in a few days, and here it's 40 days. So mudslides, wherever you go, landslides, a lot must have happened from above. And then, of course, from below, the tsunamis, eroding the lands, making a clean sweep and landing material out of the sea and transporting whole ecosystems. And searching higher and then retreating, as we know, that can happen with tsunamis. And when the ocean rises, the bottom of the ocean rises, then probably the continent could have sunken. It's a question of balance. And if the land sinks and the ocean rises, then of course flooding will have happened. It was a big catastrophe. This is what happened just with a small catastrophe. Eruption of the Mount St. Helens in North America, the northwest of America. 4 meters of sediment being formed in a short time. And it looks like all these layers have been laid on top of each other, layer by layer, but that's not the way it happened. Sediments can, in flowing mud and flowing waters, can be formed sideways. And then the setting is horizontal. That's what we know from experiments. But here we have a process in the flood, with a process of weeks. So much more must have happened. Here we see that new canyons have been formed in just a matter of days, but here we see a lot more happening. And of course, running and flying animals could have tried to escape. And when they eventually die, they will not sink right away. The animals like fish, etc., sink sooner than animals like mammals and birds keep floating for a long time. And then these dinosaurs, these nests have been found. And nests of dinosaurs just laid on bare ground is a bit strange. I think they wouldn't do that. It must have been stress nests, laying eggs. Of course, these big ones, these big animals, could have escaped longer than the smaller ones. So we see that they could have been running before the flood, and then if the tsunami goes back, they are stressed and they lay their eggs and they keep on running again for the next wave coming. We see sometimes straight lines of footsteps, not wandering, trying to find food, but straight lines. And mass burial sites of only dinosaurs sometimes, but also other mass burial sites, witnessing a great catastrophe. And the sediments being formed, well, it must have been a clean sweep. The geography of the whole earth must have changed considerably. Whole ecosystems being transported from the sea and landed, and it must have been a complex process. And thick layers of sediments have been formed. And then we turn to the end of what happened, and we take a look at Psalm 104, where we read something that I think is what happened during the flood. Verse 6. You covered it. It is about the earth. He who laid the foundations of the earth, that's verse 5. You covered it with a deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, as we read in chapter 7 of Genesis. At your rebuke they fled. That's what we read in chapter 8. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. The mountains rose and the valleys sunk to the place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. And that's the promise the Lord gives at the end. Chapter 8, we will read that. So it's at God's command that the waters flow down. the balance is restored. Think about the ocean bottom being light and thin when it was ripped open and replaced by a new layer, and then gradually getting thicker and denser, and then sinking again, and then of course the continent rising again, and also mountains rising like the Alps. Here we see Mont Blanc, and of course the Himalayas being formed probably by India moving at a pretty high speed towards Asia and landing there, and these mountains were being formed. New mountains rise and deep troughs are formed, sometimes even more than 10 kilometers deep. And a supercontinent in the process must have been broken up at some point. We don't know exactly when that happened. Models differ there and thoughts differ, but it must have been broken up some way at some time. Fresh sediments have been formed, thick but soft layers first of all. As we see here in the Grand Canyon, of course, it's a bit like what happened with Mount St. Helens, but it's so much bigger, and the sediments have been formed at such a wide level, layers being the same for hundreds of kilometers, especially in North America, we see that. And this, well, how is this formed? The rivers flow from the continent and they carve out the canyons like we know from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and then they harden to rock, and then a tableland on top. That's what we expect with such a model, such a thing happening. The water flowing from the continent because the continent comes up again and the water flows off the continent. And the fossils witness to the flood. The most of them are formed on the water like these animals, small animals that are being caught in a kind of mudslide, closed off from oxygen. That's, well, the prerequisite for fossils to be formed. They need to be closed off from oxygen pretty quickly, especially if there are soft tissues involved like this sea lily. Very soft. It would rot within hours, but it must have been buried very quickly, and we have quite a few examples of it. Just the same as this one must have been caught in the act, eating a big fish, eating a small one, and then caught in the act and fossilized. Of course, the fossilization process takes time, but being caught must have happened quickly, being buried and closed off from oxygen so that the fossilization process can start. And we also see polystrate fossils like these ones, trees running through several layers that can't happen must have happened within a short period of time and not millions of years. And we know from, for instance, this again, the Mount St. Helens, the Spirit Lake, where you see tree trunks upright, standing, swimming, you could say, floating in the water. And of course, if there a big kind of layer of sediment is dropped in it, then of course something like this could happen also. Which layers are of the flood and which aren't? Well, that's a debate. And we don't know exactly. We have to be open. But then, after the flood, we have a new start. There are many questions left. We don't know everything, but let's take a look again at what Genesis tells us. Genesis 8. And God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. God's command, remember? The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth, flowing off the continent. Remember? At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month. So half a year it had floated, and now it's rested on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So it took a long time. So it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made. Then he sent out a raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He could live as a scavenger. He also sent out from himself a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground, but the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot. He must have had a tree or something, and it wasn't there yet, and she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and drew her into the ark to himself. And he waited yet another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. And the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. Olives, well, these can revive pretty soon and can withstand a lot. And Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So he waited yet another 7 days and sent out the dove, which did not return to him anymore. So he had found his home. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, that the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. Then God spoke to Noah. He had remembered him so that he could start again, and then after about half a year, he spoke to him again and say, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your son's wife with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth." They have to spread and fill the earth again. And that's a process which we will talk about next time. "And be fruitful and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, went out of the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma, a resting aroma. It's manoah, what is actually said here. Then the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imaginations of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease." So here we have it, the new start the Lord wants. Noah had to wait a whole year, so it was a long process, and half a year he was on the Ararat before he could get out. But the Lord wants a new start, and he makes a new start with Noah and his family, and with all the animals in the ark, and of course some in the sea will also have survived. But he also promised not to send a big flood again. So here we have it, a new start with a burnt offering being offered and the Lord being praised. Take a look here. Look at the rainbow. Beautiful. It's a promise from God that he'll never again flood the entire earth. If we see a rainbow, we can remember his promise. My Christian professor, says the son, said that Noah's flood didn't cover the whole earth. He told you it was just a local flood. That's what he said. A bit strange maybe. So he believes that God promised to never again send a local flood. That will we know that happens again and again. But a flood, as in Noah's days, God promised not to send it again. And the whole language of this whole story of the flood assures us it's a worldwide flood. And why would Noah build an ark anyway to save animals? No, not necessary. He could just move away. Time enough. No, that was not necessary. So that's what he did. He built an ark to save his family and all these animals. And God promised not to send a flood again. He knows what's in the heart of man, but he wants to make a new start all over again and again, with us also. So let's praise him for his wonderful works. Amen.